Okay, well, welcome all. Sorry, I was just getting the question machine because that's important. I want you to see this session as super exciting. Now, it's not going to be as super exciting perhaps as the Greater Springfield or Hamishville, because that is really big, ambitious thinking. But I do want you to see this, not just because it's the last session either, but I want you to see this as exciting, so I want you to draw on all of that stuff. And we are sitting here really potentially with a blank page. And you've got the opportunity, and this panel is going to discuss this, about what are the opportunities for private capital to facilitate the delivery of infrastructure to accelerate the delivery of affordable housing. So I want you to steal Russell's line actually before steal his job. Think about how do we implement that vision. And I liked Hamish's pen, it was brilliant, but I don't think we need to we can't give up on the current city and the current infrastructure we have. So how do we do that better? We can't retrofit it perhaps, but certainly we need to do better around it. So let's implement that vision down with what we've got. So I want you guys to get on your phones through this next 25 minutes and think, what would make this work? What do we need from government to make this work? And what does success look like, and what do we think successful outcomes would be that would attract this private capital? So the context, I think, as Nick mentioned before, is the previous government policy of attracting private investment in roading and water infrastructure, quite specifically, to accelerate housing development, given in particular the constraints on the council's balance sheet, so allowing that funding to happen where perhaps it couldn't be accommodated by the councils. So those underlying facts haven't changed, the government's changed, but notwithstanding the new government and the signalled new policies, I'm going to turn to our panel, and John, I'll start with you. Is a government infrastructure fund still necessary? Do we still need it, and what's its role?
Yes, Sarah, I think we do. There's been talk about the vision. I'd like to talk a little bit about alignment of vision. And I think with the new government, what we're seeing is a change of priorities, a change of how we are to realise that vision. But fundamentally, the first and most important thing we must start from is a common and aligned vision. And you know, sometimes it's easy to take for granted that we're all talking about the same thing, but that's not always the case. And I think you need to get into a level of detail to ensure that we do have a common vision, because once you've established that and you've got a commitment in the long term, then it's a lot easier to go forward from there.
If you see the delivery of infrastructure as reasonably non-partisan now, and I think a common vision to deliver affordable housing, which I think sits on no matter what colour you vote for, and you move to the policy perspective and you hope that private capital will come, because I think we've had signalled 600 million or something through the infrastructure fund, but we need more than that. So as the private sector and the provider of capital, what do you say to government and officials, many of whom may be in the room? What are the policy settings that you need, Rob, to actually make for the delivery of successful infrastructure? What will make you invest from a policy perspective?
I think from a policy perspective, clarity, number one, and the ability to move forward on a common grounding with some purpose. I think the alignment that John mentioned is critical as well. I think the other aspect is a recognition that there's a temporal aspect to these things. The Springfield example we saw this afternoon is an incredible example that has occurred over a really long period of time, and not being a local, but it strikes me that I'm not sure the amount of time is available in this context. So I think from a policy setting perspective, there needs to be a recognition that things need to happen on an accelerated basis to deal with current problems today. So that's going to involve some concessions, some and almost definitely government support to accelerate the delivery of infrastructure and therefore the achievement of the housing goals.
And to be fair, sorry Sarah, to be fair though, I think even in the very recent announcements in relation to housing. There's definitely some urgency in the new Minister of Housing's statements around how we're going to get to 10,000 houses a year. I suppose when I think about that question of what's required, it seems to me that the issues around housing have been kind of well known and well rehearsed. There was an Auckland Housing Summit a couple of months ago with a lot of people in the room from a whole lot of different sectors, and the issues that we've had around constraints with labour, constraints with building materials, lack of scale, I think are all things that have been recognised in the recent policy statements. But I suppose there's a real desire among the private sector to invest and to be part of a partnership with the government to build more houses. I think there's sort of strong demand from the private sector would be, I suppose, the first point. And I think some of the things that we've seen in the recent announcements too have been really positive. So I think there's been a discussion around de-risking the projects and the need for the government to be involved with that. What I would urge though is for those who are involved on the Crown, the government side of the fence, is to just really engage early around the structure that the new developments would have. I think you mentioned earlier, Sarah, when we were talking the three different ways in which the housing goals would be achieved, and the third one was new developments and what those new developments would look like. So engage early. It's there's a lot of expertise out there. People have been thinking about these issues for a number of years now. And the other thing I would say is to the extent possible, learn from some of the the processes in the past that might have been less successful. There've been probably some housing development projects that haven't gone as well as hoped, and there's some some learnings there. But engage early, talk to the people who want to fund, and let's try and make it, as Rob said, a simple model will attract capital from New Zealand, and also that point that Carl mentioned in the previous presentation, overseas capital potentially as well.
I think that early engagement is absolutely critical, and particularly when you're looking at how do we fund this. And I'd like to pick that up because we've had a really great discussion today around funding versus financing, and the previous government was looking at funding of these SPVs for road and water infrastructure through, I think, an availability payment-esque type regime, which took the revenue from councils from targeted rates and volumetric charging. And so if we step back and we look at our blank page, is there an opportunity now, do you think, to actually consider other funding sources, which I think do require early engagement, and a la Crossrail? And what could those be? Could we implement value capture or something like that? And I'll put that to you, John, and then perhaps, Rob, if you could say, how would private investment look at that?
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, no, certainly I think the answer again is yes. The ability to draw upon all funding sources is a critical issue. And it doesn't really matter whether you're looking at how they've financed the metro up in Beijing or smaller projects globally. You just can't rely upon one source. So a structure that enables you to appropriately allocate risk between the parties, between the public sector and the private sector, and for that structure then to be able to accommodate and bring in early innovation and constructability, as well as making sure that there's a long, a 35-year certainty around, say, availability payment or a hybrid of that, is really critical in getting something that actually is ultimately bankable, because essentially the banks are providing a substantial portion of the finance here, and then as I think we get back to the whole thing about the vision and the people and making sure that everything is fit for purpose.
Yeah, from an investment perspective, I think if the goal is bringing forward and improving the housing stock, then looking at how we fund the infrastructure that supports that, then clearly rates, etc., and value uplift from the development of new centres is an excellent way to fund that. In terms of financing, however, you've got to get the money to build the stuff in the first place. And there's going to be a time element between those happening, and there's going to be a great degree of uncertainty in terms of when and how quickly the funding sources will come on stream. So I think that's where, someone who looks at financing these projects, that's where I think the government can play its most useful role in bridging that gap between the time at which the monies are there to pay for the good and the availability of finance to actually deliver the underlying infrastructure, be that road, water, even light rail, whatever is required to activate some precincts and actually see this development occurring. To bring that forward and to actually have the private sector finance that, I see a temporary role of government to, whether it's underpinning a certain level of demand that ultimately it falls to the private sector thereafter, or various mechanics can be put in place to bring forward the finance to enable the funding and revenue streams to pay for the assets to come later.
We're talking a lot about what needs to be done and for this to be done at pace. John Paul, you've done the finance transactions. You've also done work for, I think, for New Zealand Housing Foundation, who's working independently in quite a different model. I mean, are we ready? Are we ready to do this at pace? I mean, you're hearing words from Phil Twyford going like the clappers. Are we ready to go like the clappers? Have we got the structures in place so that Rob's going to invest?
Oh, I think, obviously there are constraints around going like the clappers. But even in the Housing Foundation, the Waimahia housing project, which was the one I referred to earlier, that's got private debt in it. And that's, I think, it's 300 houses, so it's a relatively small development, but it's a good example of it. The fact that there are already housing projects out there that are working, that are building good houses. I think there were 4 different builders on that particular project, and one of the builders went bust, and there's a sort of seamless take up of by the others. So it was really well managed, well organised, well executed. But having said that, 10,000 a year is a lot. I think with a clear, that sort of really clear goal and clear strategy and vision that John talked about, getting that kind of clarified reasonably quickly, I think certainly the private sector likes to move really quickly and want to be involved, do things in very tight time frames. So going like the clap is achievable, but it just needs to be really clear up front what the model looks like. So that's the hard thing. But as we discussed before, I think better to take a little bit of time up front and get that right, and that will allow more of an acceleration once you get going.
Yeah, focused off on that, I think you can either go like the clappers or get the perfect outcome. It's very hard to go like the clappers and get the perfect outcome. So I think some concessions are required. If speed is the driver, then it needs to be acknowledged that there's going to have to be a bridge formed by government in order to get the end outcome.
Sarah, I'd suggest it's probably a bit more of a bridge. We might need something a bit greater than that. Because, look, face the reality, the volume that we are talking about is just unprecedented. And so I think it's foolish to think that if we do the same thing over and over, we will achieve or make that transition to that much greater volume. So therefore, we must consider and think about how we're going to do things quite differently. And that will challenge the status quo. It will challenge and create reaction in the market to disruption. But we need the disruption. We need to leverage off what's happening internationally. We need to be able to, like Springfield has done, draw in that expertise and find how we can partner that expertise with what we've got locally and not lose what we've got locally, but not try and sit here in isolation and learn what other people have been learning throughout the world and, in the last 5 or 10 years.
So how does the government create a platform for that? Because we've had in the last days that we will have Kiwi Build, which will, perhaps creates the building opportunity, and we have a government fund. Crown Office might be there, might be not. We've also got mention of a new central agency and Housing Affordability Authority. Who does what? I mean, who does what and creates the platform to actually bring, but still bring the innovation? And while bringing the innovation, to go back to some of the conversations that we had earlier, how do we make sure that we get the sound, fundable business cases and the idea of making that first impression on the investors? How do we make sure that we get that and innovation?
Sarah, there's a lot of different questions in there, but I'd suggest the common theme is leadership, and leadership's required both at a central government and local government level, together with industry. And so I think it's, talking to some of the government officials in the audience, I think it's about how agencies like MB, immigration can help the private sector try and cut through some of the regulation which is stifling some of these innovative approaches. Innovation by its very nature will be disruptive, and it will hit barriers to entry, and we need that joined up thinking and cooperation across all of the agencies and the industry to try and break through that. Otherwise, that scale that we talked about will be unattainable.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really impressed me in New Zealand over the last 5 or 6 years has been that at the government level, actually developing and delivering some really interesting and well put together infrastructure projects. So I'd hope that with the change in government, that doesn't get lost. Is number one. You talk about delivery agencies, etc. There's a lot of quality already here. The second thing I would say is that given the specific subject matter, is it's more of a council. It's much more local government oriented, and so clearly the next step has to be taking some of that in collaboration at the local and wider government.
The key headline of this panel was getting you to invest, Rob, and how do we attract the private capital. So who are you? Who are the private investors, and what do they look like, and what opportunities are they looking for, and is this the kind of thing?
Oh, I won't give a long answer. I know people want to go home. It's Friday afternoon. But in terms of the investors, I guess it is important to note that there's equity investors, there's debt investors, and there's infrastructure investors, and there's property investors. And so there's no one answer that sort of says they're all looking for the same thing. And one of our challenges quite regularly is trying to find the right investors for projects that have an element that is both infrastructure in nature and property in nature. And no, there's nothing more of a hybrid than building infrastructure to support housing. So there's no one sort of thing that anyone's looking for. But I would say that the key is to try and identify projects and risk allocations that appeal to each of those sets. So in the example, of housing, clearly there's a lot of property development risk in housing, and that's rightly and readily borne by property developers. In the supporting infrastructure, there's a whole bunch of capital waiting to be deployed, both locally and internationally, but they don't have the same risk appetite. So trying to carve out infrastructure projects, be it a light rail or trunk infrastructure, that is of lower risk to those investors, at least in the early phases until it's fully utilised, is important to sort of get the risk allocation aimed at those people. Following those will be the debt providers, and again, they tend to fall into both those two camps as well. And New Zealand is competing in a global marketplace for international banks to come and provide funding. Had some great success so far, but there's much more out there, and it's trying to put some correctly identified risk allocation projects forward to the market.
On your top three, you can answer this, Jay, but what are the top three risks that government should then actually retain? Where do you see demand risk sitting, and will that attract your capital quicker?
I think the demand risk is is going to be a really key commercial risk, and I think that's also been recognised by the new minister, and so that sort of de-risking that's been talked about in relation to Kiwi Build is going to be a really important aspect. I suppose the other things I think about are having real clarity around the structure for the investment, and so it's clarity around the risk allocation, as Rob mentioned, but also what does the structure look like and how does it work? And certainly there's a suggestion that Hobsonville Point development and that HLC structure and company that's used out there will be the model that will be used for or be replicated in greater size for sort of housing developments going forward. So that at least I think is something that's known. So it's about understanding what the structure is, understanding what the risk allocation is, and also having it as simple as possible, I think. We've probably had a few of the housing projects to date that have been quite bespoke and pretty complicated. It needs to be really clearly understood, who owns the properties, how transfer might work on termination, that kind of thing. So yeah, that would probably be my reaction.
When you're looking at infrastructure sitting with urban development, John, from your perspective and your history with local government, where do you see the opportunities here that we are missing and that have been too siloed?
I think there's a real opportunity to continue to move closer to integrating and truly integrating, so all forms of infrastructure with the land use. And I think that has to be done, especially around in the light rail projects. That's a huge opportunity. For example, if you look at the business case for the light rail to the airport, as Jacobs have done, a small deviation of that alignment can pick up some quite major urban regeneration opportunities in Mount Roskill and Mangere, and then have a consequential positive impact around some of the economic, social and cultural outcomes that have been trying to be achieved as well. So, I think we need to stand back from some of the work that's done. There's always a lot of good work done, but the skill in city building, I think, is to stand back and be able to see the bigger picture and recognise a wider vision and pick up on those opportunities and put forward something that truly integrates both infrastructure and real estate development that benefits the community.
Having the Minister for Housing and Urban Development as the same Minister for Transport is obviously going to be helpful in that regard, so I think it's something people are conscious of.
So we have a couple of minutes left, and I'd like you to give your private sector wisdom to the incoming government. John, what would you say?
Well, I think one of the things I remembered first up when I started in Waterfront Auckland was with Sir Bob Harvey, and I went to the World City Summit in Singapore. So I would say, think big, dream big, believe the impossible, and believe in yourself, because it all starts with leadership.
Mine's really simple. I just think engage early, and things can happen really quickly.
For me, it's consistency. It's recognising that these projects we're talking about are massively long-term things, and they're not subject there. Electoral cycles are highly relevant, but there's a long amount of planning and a long time for these projects to be delivered. And so I think that consistency through cycles is key.
Well, thank you all.